Living under a dictatorship for a long time can make it seem like it will last forever, or at least outlast you. The authorities control all key aspects of society, and with each passing year there is little hope for change. Dictatorships themselves often promote a politics of eternity. Take, for example, the Thousand-Year Reich, with its monumental architecture designed to remain impressive even in ruins. Or the USSR, the unbreakable union that many thought would never collapse. Yet, even the most unbreakable authoritarian regimes, and certainly the thousand-year ones, eventually fall. But why and how? In this video, we'll explore how dictatorship typically ends, and sometimes the dictators themselves. What is the main weakness of autocracies? Why does power sometimes go to former dentists? And what exactly is a dictatorship? And traditionally, unlike many videos on this topic, we'll focus on facts, statistics, and history. No wishful thinking, rumors, or far-fetched parallels. We'll stick to the facts, because here we don't fall for the extremes. Originally, the term dictator didn't carry a negative connotation. In the Roman Republic, it referred to a special official who, appointed by the Senate, held sole power for a limited time to address a serious crisis. For example, Yevhen Petrushevich was appointed as the dictator of West Ukrainian People's Republic in this sense. Of course, no modern political regime openly identifies itself as a dictatorship. In fact, even the most authoritarian countries often use the word democratic in their names, like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So how do we identify a dictatorship? Yale University political science professor Milan Svolik, in his work The Politics of Authoritarian Rule, defines a dictatorship as a state that fails to meet at least one of the two characteristics of democracy: the election of the legislative body through free and competitive elections, or the election of the head of executive power through free and competitive election, or by a legislative body. Using this definition, dictatorship include one-party Cuba, nations led by eternal presidents like Belarus, or the absolute monarchies of the Middle East. Finally, to clarify, like the researchers whose books we relied on, we'll use the term dictatorship and authoritarian regime interchangeably. Also, we will not single out totalitarianism among other non-democratic forms. If you're curious about totalitarianism, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button while you're there. Dictatorships often compare themselves to a weak, inefficient democracy. They argue that all the procedures, bureaucracy, and lack of decisive leadership only holds back a country's development. In contrast, the firm hand of a leader, party, or military junta is presented as a key to progress. And yes, some authoritarian governments have been successful, but many more have failed. For every Park Chung-hee who laid the foundations of South Korea's growth, there are a dozen Kim Il-sungs or Assads, whose countries are hardly places anyone would want to live. After all, dictatorship control vast power and resources, but a number of issues prevent them from managing them wisely. Political science professor Gene Sharp discusses these issues in his book From Dictatorship to Democracy, which was labeled by Lukashenko and Russian officials as a manual for orange revolutions. In essence, Sharp argues that dictatorships are hostages to their own pasts. They struggle to adapt to social and global changes, especially if they cling to a rigid ideology. Moreover, when changes occur that dictators dislike, the system tries to ignore them. Subordinates often hide facts from the leadership out of fear. A classic example is the personal newspaper of Portuguese dictator Salazar, which was crafted in his final years to ensure he wouldn't learn that he had been ousted from power or that Americans has landed on the moon. It's no surprise that excessive control over the bureaucratic system doesn't prevent corruption or internal conflicts. A small group of people often makes the most critical decisions, and they can't be experts in everything. This leads to more management mistakes. Add to the fact that autocracies often worsen national, social, and religious tensions. But the most critical moment for any dictatorship is the transfer of power. In nearly half of the cases, the regime ends when the ruler steps down, whether through resignation or death, natural or otherwise. This marks the end of the regime. Democracies have a predictable, stable process for renewing power. In contrast, dictatorships lack formal succession rules. Even if regular elections are held with seemingly opposition candidates, everyone knows in advance who will win. Excluding monarchies like Saudi Arabia, hereditary power transfers rare in dictatorships. Examples include North Korea with its Kim dynasty ruling for 3 generations, or Aliyev's in Azerbaijan. Dictators often hesitate to choose a successor because that person might seize power early or create divisions among the elites. A soft transfer of power while the autocrat is still alive can undermine their influence. As seen when Kazakhstan's Nazarbayev clan lost control over Tokayev, once thought to be a puppet, came to power. This reminds dictators of the need to hold on to power until the very end. Unfortunately, the death of a dictator rarely leads to democratization. History shows that more often than not, the regime continues in one form or another. After World War II, more than 2/3 of autocracies emerged from other non-democratic systems. Building a free and accountable society is a complex process, and often things continue by inertia. This is a key argument for those who believe that fundamental changes in Russia will come with Putin's death. The natural death of a ruler is the most favorable scenario for an authoritarian regime. In 76% of cases, the regime remains stable for at least 5 years afterwards. In contrast, when power is handed over through other means, this stability drops by more than half. Often after a dictator's death, a compromising figure takes over, someone whom the regime's old guard can easily control. After all, what could an ex-dentist or a low-key planning minister do? The presence of a strong old guard political or military faction increases the chances that the dictatorship will survive. This was the case after the deaths of Stalin and Mao, who, despite being central to their regimes, did not bring down the Red empires. But you didn't tune in to learn how dictatorship managed to live long and happy life, did you? In the book How Dictatorship Works, researchers analyzed 223 cases of autocracies dying between 1946 and 2010, identifying 7 common scenarios. The rarest outcome is the complete collapse of the country, like in Somalia, where the state vanished after the fall of the communist regime in 1991. Next in frequency is foreign intervention, as with the ousting of the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia by neighboring Vietnam. Imagine being such a brutal communist dictatorship that a less bloody one feels the need to intervene. In 8% of cases, a shift in the political elite occurs, leading to the gradual change from one regime to another. This happened during the breakup of Yugoslavia. In particular, the chairman of the Presidium of former Socialist Serbia, Slobodan Milosevic, was replaced by no one else than Slobodan Milosevic himself, now as the president of Serbia. Another 8% of dictatorship ended with armed insurrection turning into civil war, such as in Libya when Gaddafi's regime fell. And now let's explore the most common scenarios for the end of dictatorships in more detail. The image of a people's uprising is one of the most recognized scenarios for the end of a dictatorship. However, less than a fifth of all autocracies have fallen due to public movements and protests. The high recognition of this option can be explained by the dramatic nature of popular uprisings, which demonstrate the possibility of fighting back against the government. Sometimes uprisings are peaceful, like the Velvet Revolution in former Czechoslovakia, which overthrew the Soviet-backed regime without bloodshed. Other times, uprisings follow a more violent script, such as the fall of Nicolae Ceausescu, the communist president of Romania, the genius of the Carpathians, and full-water Danube of mind, who had a cult of personality, suddenly lost support amid an economic crisis. The tipping point came during a mass rally where he was booed by the crowd. Just a few days later, Ceausescu and his wife were executed. An important factor in the success of a popular uprising is the public's belief that victory is achievable and that participation is not lethally dangerous. Otherwise, the desire for free ride and the decision to wait it out will prevail. For dictatorships, there are two options. Either make concessions and allow for a peaceful transition of power, or fight to hold onto it at all costs. The choice largely depends on how personalized the autocracy is. The more power concentrated in the hand of a single leader, the more likely they are to hold on until the bitter end. Such leaders are less likely to step down peacefully, fearing the consequences of losing power. Elections are common in most autocracies and serve several purposes. However, the primary function of elections, changing the government, is not one of them. In dictatorships, elections are used to anchor legitimacy, demonstrate legality, and mobilize a loyal population. Therefore, the results often reflect not the will of the people, but the available resources of the ruling government. Surprisingly, elections are the second most common cause of the end of dictatorships. Some dictators do not wait for rebellion or foreign intervention to overthrow them, but instead dismantle their own regimes through elections and democratization. This happened in Taiwan, when President Lee Teng-hui abolished the temporary provision effective during the period of communist rebellion, which had allowed his party to bypass the constitution. These provisions had been in place for 40 years. Afterward, Lee supported the first free presidential elections, which he won. But in the next elections, for the first time in half a century, an opposition candidate won, marking the definitive end of authoritarianism in Taiwan. Of course, dictators do not call elections out of generosity, but because of growing societal and political tensions. Holding elections can be seen as a way to retain at least some influence, as demonstrated by Chilean General Augusto Pinochet. In the late 80s, Pinochet's regime faced significant economic and societal challenges, and support both domestically and internationally dwindled. After losing a plebiscite, Pinochet quickly lost political power. However, he remained commander-in-chief of the army for another 8 years and retained significant influence. Despite facing prosecution at the end of his life, he died before a verdict was reached. Not the worst end for a dictator. Coups are the most common way both to establish and to end a dictatorship. This method requires the least number of people. Sometimes only a few influential accomplices are enough. However, about half of coup attempt fails, making it a last resort when all other options seem hopeless. Coups are usually brief and result in fewer casualties compared to foreign intervention or civil war. A notable example is the bloodless Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974, carried out by opposition officers. This is also one of rare cases where a coup led to democratization. However, more often than not, coup results in a rise of new authoritarian regime, as seen repeatedly in Afghanistan. In 1973, Afghanistan's monarchy was overthrown by a coup led by none other than a king's cousin. 5 years later, the cousin himself became the victim of a coup, this time by the communist Reds, who established the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. But even this regime didn't last long. The leader was ousted and killed during Soviet operation just 104 days after taking power. This cycle of ambitions and political violence has continued in Afghanistan till this day. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the world have actively discussed possibilities for the fall of Putin's regime or the disintegration of Russia. However, despite numerous leaks and insider revelation, a state coup has not occurred, regardless of the constant headlines about searching for Putin's successors in Kremlin or power struggles in Moscow. And after the lackluster reaction to mobilization and the departure of at least some level of opposition, talk of a popular uprising or revolution has faded. As for elections, there is little point in building illusory hopes for change, just as with foreign intervention. So what should we be waiting for? We don't know. The current authoritarian regime in Russia, like all others, won't last forever. But based on the experiences of other autocracies and Russian history itself, it seems highly unlikely that the system for electing the government in the aggressor country will change fundamentally. And worst of all, it's not just about Russia. Global trends are showing that the level of democracy worldwide has been declining for the 17th consecutive year. Neither democratic procedures, the rule of law, nor a developed economy will arrive on their own. These are things we must constantly fight for and carefully nurture. So don't forget to support those who are fighting to keep your country peaceful for now. Our suggestions can be found in the description below. The world is going through a new cycle of change, and that is why it's so important for us not to fall for the extremes. See you.